Hey guys, we are back with another video, and this time we are taking a look at the biggest trades from the 13-14 season. Uh, we will focus only on the trades, and I will begin without any further introduction with a couple of honorable mentions. Uh, all of these trades could have made the top 10 because it's a top 10 we're looking at, but they didn't, mostly because all of them were pretty one-sided. And you see here the first one is a Steelers and Turtles trade, in which, in my defense, I loved Steve Ott back when I started doing fantasy and basically traded for his old self, which was a pretty disastrous trade, considering Tom Wilson went the other way and he would eventually become the better version of Steve Ott in his best days. So, in my defense, again, Tom Wilson didn't seem like he would get out of a bottom 6 row at that time. So yeah, but I guess he did. Next, also, like in my trade with Elliot, I don't know what Brad was thinking here in acquiring two certified Band-Aid boys in Lupo and Wise. Wise virtually didn't play for him after he was acquired, and Lupo had one good season with 20 plus goals, but he gave up Eberle, who over 3 years had like 180 points on his remaining contract that went the way of the Royals. Hanzo was always great when healthy in our format, especially counting face-off percentage. And Matt Fraser was a legit prospect at this point still, although he didn't pan out. Maybe Brad knew that he wouldn't, so it wasn't much of a gamble for him, but still, he got next to nothing in this trade. And the last one on this honorable mention list, the Tigers. They got Duncan Keith, Chimera, and Ryan Murphy to rent out Marty St. Louis to the Warriors. And this, it was not maybe as bad as the other two, but Duncan Keith was still a top 10 defenseman, like we saw in the previous video, and Ryan Murphy was still a top-notch prospect at this point. So this was a pretty hefty price to pay for a 38-year-old rental in Marty St. Louis. He did have a good season with close to 70 points, St. Louis that is, but was still really about to end his career. So these were the honorable mentions. And we go into the top 10, and the top 10 first entry, trade between the Turtles and the Vipers. You see which side got which. And below, this time I will evaluate trades and pick a winner between the teams. I will not shy away from that. And I've split the evaluations in short-term and long-term impact, with short-term being the impact over the current season and the next, so 2 years from the trade, and long-term is there anything longer than that. So this particular trade, on the Turtle side, they got no future, so they didn't have any value in long-term. Elliot had a very good season in timeshare duty with Halak in St. Louis. But Leguant was already basically done at this point, so he wasn't a contributor. On the other side, the Vipers, they got Jokinen, who was decent, and what they managed to do is, although this is noted as a deadline deal, the actual deadline was January 5th. So before that deadline, they managed to flip Clemensen for Harding, which was a great move because Harding had maybe his best season that year. and unfortunately, due to health problems, he's last. And they also got a third rounder, which was a decent future piece in Jace Horiluk, who develops quite slowly and doesn't seem to have the offensive flair for the NHL, but still it was a fair or close to fair value as a future piece. And in terms of evaluation, I'd give the nod to the Vipers, because with Harding and Jokinen they got better present value, and with Horiluk they got also some future value. So well done to Sheldon, the then owner of the Detroit Vipers, now Hearst, of course. And number 9, this is an off-season deal between Sparta and Dubai. And what the only piece that Sparta got was Luongo, so this was the Luongo trade for them. And the Mighty Camels got Goligoski and the first round selection, which they used to select Nick Ritchie. And the Luongo didn't stay a Warrior for long though. He was traded in the beginning of the season, so he didn't actually play a game for the Warriors. And they acquired Nabokov, Kemper, and a third round pick. So not really a great haul, because Nabokov was already a below average goaltender at this point, and Kemper was a long way from becoming relevant. And at the third rounder, the interesting thing about this particular pick and many such mid and late round picks is that they got they got moved so many times. Like for example, this pick was moved 6 times before an actual selection was made with it. So it was actually so difficult to track what happened with those picks that I gave up on it. And for some, you either see that they were made, the selection was made by another team, or we don't track the selection, like here, just count it as some future value. And in terms of evaluation, because Nabokov wasn't very good and Kemper was far from being good, and the third round selection was traded in some other trade, I gave pretty mediocre evaluation on this trade for the Sparta side. And on the Dubai side, Goligoski was a solid 35 to 40 point guy at this point, as he was really consistent. And Nick Ritchie, while maybe hasn't still developed to be that great as a first round selection, he's still I'd say more valuable in our format than in real life, at least so far in his career. So a definite win for Clint and the Mighty Camels in this one. So number 8 is a trade that's made in season, and the Ramparts and the Vipers made a deal. And this, I'd say, is one of the most even deals on the whole list. Both teams got a decent defenseman, a not so decent forward, and a mid-round selection, which they both didn't use to make a selection themselves. So they were traded for in other trades with other teams, and that's why you see the evaluations. I see are very similar, and I only give a slight nod to the Ramparts, just because Garrison had 2 years on his deal, and these were the last 2 years when Garrison was any good. So they managed to get the most out of it. And Timonen, he was comparable to Garrison in year 1, but he was only a rental. That's why I give the nod to the Ramparts in this one. On number 7, we see the Turtles again in already a really deadline deal with with the Montreal Wanderers. And we see here that both teams, we don't see futures for presence in this trade. The Wanderers, they went after Vanek, who was considered top-notch and asset at this stage, and also got Hagelin, who was never really good in fantasy. And on the other side, the Turtles got Hudwer and Silverberg, who was just starting to become a regular and was on his EOC. And a third round selection, which turned out to be Kevin Hayes, although that selection was made by Sparta. A pretty good third round selection for Sparta. But in terms of evaluation, Montreal, they got close to the whole season. Vanek was close to 30 goals, so it was not his best season. But he did boost their forwards a bit. They got no futures in this trade. And on the other side, the Turtles, Silverberg was already better than Hagelin at this stage, and Hudwer was not a lot worse than Vanek. But this was not the one big season of Hudwer. He exploded in 14-15. So the Turtles weren't didn't strike lucky with this one, but because of the many years left on Silverberg and the third round selection, I think this is a definite win for Elliott and the Turtles, because they didn't lose much in terms of production and gained a lot for the future. So this was a good trade for them. And number 6 spot, we see already a classical deadline deal in which one team gets the present and one team gets the futures. And the team who was, he didn't consider himself a contender, was Mark's Las Vegas Ice Dice, and they got a second rounder, third rounder, and throw in Rich Clune, who was actually solid. Maybe this was his only solid season. He was a penalty minutes monster that time. But it was his only really full NHL season. But anyway, more important, of course, is that they made the most of this second round selection in selecting Martin Jones, who is still on their roster and has 3 more years as of today. So great pick. We all know how valuable it is to manage to pick and develop a starting goalie through the draft. So that's why I'd say that although they traded away the third rounder and he didn't become a valuable piece for them, they still got more than good value out of this trade in terms of future. And on the other side, the Tigers, they were the defending champions at that time and still gunning for another playoff run. So they got Justin Williams and Quark MacArthur both as rentals, and the 4th round pick that was later swapped in another deal. Interesting thing was that in this season as rentals, Quark MacArthur was actually the better piece than Justin Williams. It was before injuries killed his career, but still both of them, they were not game changers. So I'd say that they got some decent value, but not great one. So, and because of that, and because of the Martin Jones and how special the goalies are, I give in this particular trade a nod to the Ice Dice, and I would say that they won the trade, looking back in hindsight. So we entered the top 5 with a mid-season trade between the Warriors and the Turtles. So we see here some teams and some players who we already saw in this video. So the Warriors traded away some players they previously acquired in Marty St. Louis and Kemper, along with Ferenc and Phillips. And Sparta, maybe from this trade, it seems that they were already not considering. So Roy, the GM of the Warriors back then, he wasn't considering himself a contender. So he switched from acquiring rentals to renting away rentals and acquiring some futures, which he did pretty well in this trade. Because Morrissey has developed well and is a valuable player, maybe a bit more valuable in real life than in fantasy. Unfortunately, Brandon Smith, this was the last year in which he developed in an upward trajectory, and then he started to plateau and maybe decline. So he didn't develop great. Now that's why the long-term impact isn't as great for the Warriors from this trade, and the short-term is pretty minimal because Cohen was pretty irrelevant as a fantasy contributor, and actually he only got some contribution from Smith in that season. And on the Turtle side, they got the best player for the present, and you can already see that Elliott was definitely looking at a run at the championship, so he was trying to acquire a lot of players. Ferenc was maybe half decent. Phillips, although on a bargain contract, he wasn't playing even up to that bargain contract because he was mostly injured and out of the NHL in the next seasons. And Kemper was a good pickup, and he had some decent games in the NHL in that season already. But because the Turtles were pretty stacked, he couldn't crack their roster, so it was more of a long-term gain with him. So they got St. Louis and Ferenc and Kemper for the future, and a clear win, I'd say. Not a clear win, okay, not a clear win, but a win for the Turtles, mostly because Smith didn't develop as expected for the Warriors. Otherwise, this trade would have been pretty balanced in terms of who got in terms of both teams getting what they wanted. So number 4 is an off-season deal. Again, we see the Sparta. So Roy was pretty active here, and the Ramparts. And in this trade, the Warriors got Mark Giordano, who was later traded for Dmitry Orlov in a one-on-one deal, 1-for-1 deal, and he didn't play for the Warriors that season. Alex Kuklachev, we all know that he didn't develop for NHL upside as expected, and a 5th round pick which was later traded away. In hindsight, that Giordano for Orlov trade was a pretty bad one for the Warriors because Giordano, he became this was the season he entered his prime, a bit late compared to most players, but he became a regular 50-ish points, 60-ish penalty minutes, and more than 100 block shots guy from that season onwards. And you saw what happened this past season where he exploded. So he has had a bit more delayed development trajectory than most players. And on the other side, the Ramparts got Corey Perry, whom we saw in the last video was still a really top-notch fantasy contributor and was worth every penny of his contract, at least in this season. And they also got Nikita Zadorov, who, while not offensively spectacular, was a solid pick in the 4th round and was on their roster until 2 seasons ago, I think. So he developed with the Ramparts. As far as evaluation go, I'd say that because they didn't keep Giordano, The Warriors got very limited value for the present, and because Kokoachev didn't develop, they got next to nothing in terms of future value too. So this was a pretty bad trade for the Warriors. And on the other side, the Ramparts got Corey Perry, who was perfectly timed this contract because sorry, uh, these 3 years they covered the last 3 years in which Perry was any good. So they squeezed the most out of him, and as I said, Zadorov was a solid pick for them, and we did provide some long-term value. Uh, Entering the top three, things get bigger, and we see here two teams that we don't see very often at the trading table, but they swing a pretty big one here. And Max and the Jackalopes get the David Perron, David Clarkson, and Anders Lindback in return for Mike Smith, Travis Zajac, Stefan Nason, and a first round selection which became Jake Virtanen for the Brooklyn Aces. So I'm not going to beat around the bush here in saying that the J-Lobs didn't do very well in this trade, and Clarkson was bought out later that season, so that's one clear way to admit it failed. Lindback was a backup, and a backup who didn't provide stellar numbers. So the only thing that worked to an extent was Perron, who was his usual self with maybe 0.6 points per game and some penalty minutes, while spending time on the injured list. And on the other side, the Aces got Mike Smith, who was decent, above average, not great in this season as a rental. Travis Zajac was always a pretty solid player in our format. Nason didn't pan out as far as offense go, so he didn't provide much value. But Virtanen is still coming along nicely, although a bit slower than many expected, and is still on the Aces roster for the foreseeable future. So I think this definite win, because they got both the definite win for the Aces, I should have said. They got both the short-term value better, and of course, because Max didn't get any futures, they got a lot more in terms of future value. Mostly in terms of the first round selection and Virtanen. And going to the number 2, we see the Flames, and again the Turtles are here. And in a deal on Christmas Day 2013, the Flames acquired Jaden Schwartz, Dan Girardi, James Wisniewski, and a first round pick, which after the lottery became the first overall selection, with which they selected Aaron Ekblad. So you see a pretty good haul for the Flames. And for the Turtles, this was the Evgeny Malkin trade. They basically got Malkin and some other pieces. Most of them turned out to be irrelevant. So it was Malkin for quite a haul. And in terms of evaluation, the Flames, they got Schwartz, who has been great when healthy. They got Ekblad. Both of them are still on their roster, and both of them have term left. So these are two pieces that they acquired 6 years ago and are still contributing and being valuable members of their team. And for the present, Schwartz was already contributing. Girardi, he was good, and I think he has always been better for our league than the NHL. Maybe not for 4.5 million good, but still pretty good. And Wisniewski, from that 3 years he had, the first was awesome. He was still great in that season, but after that, injuries really derailed him. On the side of the Turtles, they got next to nothing to show for in terms of future. But of course, Malkin was great when he was healthy, and he was healthy for most of the time, playing between 60 and 70 games each of those 3 years. So both teams, I'd say, got what they were after, but I cannot give the win to the Flames here because they got two such big pieces and for so long for their team with Schwartz and Ekblad. And before we turn the page to the number one trade in this list, let me give you a quick trivia question. Which two teams that you would have expected to be mainstays here we haven't seen yet? I think for those of you who have been around for that season, the answer should be pretty obvious, that these teams are the Ghosts and the Patriots, and then ran by Jay, who still of course runs the Ghosts, and Mark, the other Mark. We had two Marks back then, and this was a pretty huge trade. And again, you can see the pieces that were involved. This was around the first day of the season, so all of these players that were involved contributed to the respective teams for the full season. And it was the Jonathan Quick trade for the Ghosts, but that quickly became the not Jonathan Quick trade because 2 weeks later he was traded along with Pascal Dupuis for Jimmy Howard and Chris Kunitz. So these were the pieces that actually remained on the Ghosts roster until the end of the season. McBain was here too, but he was dropped soon after, I think around the same day that Quick was traded. And Kulemin, he was there, but he wasn't really non-contributor. And a 5th round pick, which was of course traded later. But look what happens on the Upper Canada Patriots side. So they got Ryan Johansson, Mark Giordano, Michael Ryder. Yeah, he was not great, but Matt Dumba, Jacob Markstrom, and a 2nd round selection. So a huge haul for Jonathan Quick. And while Howard and Kunitz both had 3-year contracts after they were acquired, and both did okay. Kunitz was great in the first season, not so great after it. Howard was hovering about average. So the Ghosts, they got the fair amount of from this trade, or fair value in terms of short term, and not a lot in terms of long term. The reason the long term here for the Ghosts isn't minimal is just because of the 3rd years of that Kunitz and Howard contracts. And on the Patriots side, Johansson was on a great contract and he was value for it for the duration of it. Like we said earlier, Giordano was just about to hit his prime. Maybe nobody knew about it, but the Patriots struck lucky. And Dumba, he's still under contract for the Patriots. I think he has 3 more seasons. Of course, Markstrom, we all know, got traded again numerous times, so it was at least 2 or 3 years before he actually established himself. But still, we cannot... I think it's as big as a hole you can get from a single trade as the Patriots did here. And they got both Johansson and Giordano for the short term, and Dumba, and again some of Giordano and some of Markstrom, and a 2nd round pick, which they traded away, but I'm sure they got some value in return. So this is a huge win for the Patriots, and not so great, not the best trade of Jay's illustrious career of trading. And that would be all. Thanks for watching. This will be the last video of the series, and we now shift our focus firmly on the auction and the preparation for next seasons. So the auction is less than three weeks away, and looking forward to seeing you around a lot more often then. So Thanks again, and bye bye.